Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Lost Vale Chronicle. Before we begin, take a second to comment where you're listening from and the exact time you're hearing this story. It's always fascinating to see where these forgotten pieces of Appalachian history travel in the middle of the night. Tonight's case isn't folklore, it isn't an urban legend, it isn't a ghost story whispered on front porches. It's a documented, state-sealed incident from the mountains of West Virginia, one so disturbing that the official records remained hidden for decades. A place the government sealed with concrete. A place locals still avoid. A place where something beneath the earth, once called people by name. Dim the lights. Settle in. And let's begin. Autumn of 1952 came early to Pocahontas County, West Virginia, slipping down the ridgelines in long ribbons of fog that clung to the trees like something remembering where it once lived. And in that fog, southeast of Marlinton, lay a narrow crease in the earth the locals never spoke about, unless they had to. Whitmer's Gap. A hollow so quiet it rang in the ears, a place where deer refused to graze, where birds refused to nest, where even insects seemed to avoid drifting over the dead still air. Hunters said the silence there felt wrong, like standing inside the lungs of something that had stopped breathing, but hadn't stopped listening. People who passed through the hollow always came out faster than they went in. Some said the wind there travelled in a straight line, as if pulled toward something beneath the soil. Others claimed the trees leaned ever so slightly inward, as though bowing toward a centre no map had ever recorded. And everyone agreed on one thing. Whitmer's Gap wasn't empty. It just kept whatever lived inside it to itself. The land was owned by a solitary farmer, Jeremiah Blackthorne, a Korean War veteran who returned home quieter than he'd left. Folks in town described him as polite but distracted, like a man walking through life with his ear pressed to some distant frequency. He tended a few cattle, kept a small garden, and lived in a weathered cabin that looked older than its lumber. Most days he spoke only when spoken to, and even then only in pieces, as though words were weight he could no longer afford. Yet the hollow's reputation didn't begin with him. Long before Blackthorne, long before the war that carved silence into his bones, Whitmer's Gap had already earned its place in Appalachian folklore. Back in the 1890s, a settler family, the Whitmers, whose name the hollow now carried like a warning, vanished without a trace. No bodies, no clothing, no signs of travel. Their cabin stood stocked with food, tools neatly hung, the table set for a meal no one ever ate. The only clue was what wasn't there. No tracks leading away, no footprints at all, as if the family had simply stepped out of the world. Locals then and now said the mountain took them. But Appalachia has always been a land where stories overlap with the land itself, where folklore sprouts from the very soil. So the disappearance of the Whitmer family folded quietly into the region's long list of things best left unquestioned. Yet in the autumn of 1952, something shifted. Fog stayed low, even on clear days. Dogs refused to walk past the mouth of the hollow, and Jeremiah Blackthorne began waking at night, stepping onto his porch with his lantern raised, staring up the slope as if he heard something calling through the trees. A sound only he could hear. A sound he later described as the ground remembering. Because Whitmer's Gap had always kept its secrets buried deep. But in 1952, something buried inside it finally woke up. On October 12, 1952, Morai Hon, state surveyor, ex-Navy engineer, and a man known for writing reports so precise they bordered on poetry, hiked into Whitmer's Gap with nothing more on his mind than tree lines, slope measurements, and the placement of a proposed logging road. The morning fog was thinning, the wind unusually still, and Hon was thinking about lunch when he stopped mid-step. Something about the hillside looked wrong. At first he thought it was just erosion from the recent rains, another washed-out embankment that would complicate his survey notes. But as he climbed the slope, brush and broken stone scratching at his boots. The shape came into view, dark, oval, and framed by uprooted roots and newly exposed earth. A cave opening, one that hadn't been on any geological record, one that didn't belong there. Hon paused at the entrance, breathing slow. He'd mapped dozens of caves across West Virginia's limestone backbone, from shallow pockets to deep systems that ran like veins under the mountains. But this one felt still. Too still. He called into the opening, expecting the usual cave acoustics, a bounce, an echo, some distant report from inside the chamber. Nothing answered. No echo. No delay. The sound simply died. He frowned, stepped closer, and listened for the steady drip of mineral water or the faint tremor of air currents that usually whispered from deep caves. But the darkness before him was not silent. It was hollow, empty in a way that felt deliberate. He knelt, grabbed a stone the size of his fist, and tossed it into the cave. He waited. And waited. No clatter of rock striking cavern floor, no scrape against limestone. Not even the faintest suggestion of distance. Just absence. Like the stone had been swallowed by something that didn't obey the rules of space. Hon wrote later in his personal notes, sound behaved incorrectly. Felt as if the cave was not accepting it. For the first time in his career, the surveyor felt a pressure behind his ribs, a sense that the air around him was watching or listening back. The forest remained silent behind him. Even the insects had faded into stillness, as if the land itself were holding its breath. Instinct told him to leave. Training told him to document. He forced himself to sketch the opening, approximate its measurements, and record the lack of expected acoustic response. But as he stood there, pencil trembling slightly, another realization chilled him. The soil around the entrance looked freshly torn, yes, but too freshly. As if the cave had not been revealed by the landslide, but opened, revealed for someone, or something. Hon closed his notebook and walked away quickly, refusing to look over his shoulder despite the prickling sense that if he did, the cave might be closer than before. He filed a partial report that afternoon, a cautious, clinical description of an anomalous cavity. But he omitted the part that frightened him. He omitted the part that made no geological sense. He should have walked away entirely. Because the cave in Whitmer's Gap had not simply appeared. It had been waiting. Before Morai Hon ever stepped foot inside the cave, he made the mistake of mentioning it to the landowner, Jeremiah Blackthorne. The hollow belonged to him, 200 acres of sloping forest, folding ridges and tangled brush, and Jeremiah knew every inch of it, or at least he believed he did. Hon approached him just after sunrise, finding the farmer mending a section of fence behind his weather-beaten cabin. Jeremiah paused only long enough to wipe sweat from his brow when he heard the word cave. "What cave?" he asked, voice flat. Hon pointed toward the tree line. "Up the embankment near the ridge. Looks like the landslide opened something. You never seen it before?" Jeremiah's hammer slipped from his hand. For several seconds he didn't blink, didn't breathe. His jaw tightened, and a shadow crept across his expression, something between fear and recognition, like he was hearing the return of a sound he'd prayed never to hear again. "It wasn't there," Jeremiah whispered. "Ain't never been there." Hon tried to explain, talking about soil shift, exposed limestone, natural collapses, but the more he spoke, the more Jeremiah backed away, shaking his head like a man refusing to hear his own diagnosis. Then came the moment Hon never forgot. He suggested they explore it together. "No." The word ripped from Jeremiah's throat, sharp enough to cut the air. "No. No. Some things stay sealed. You hear me? Sealed." He stepped between Hon and the path leading toward the slope, eyes wide, hands trembling. The reaction wasn't just fear. It was terror so deep and instinctive it bordered on animal. Hon raised both hands, startled. "I'm not trying to trespass. Just need a look for the survey." Jeremiah's voice dropped to a trembling whisper. "You shouldn't look at things that weren't meant to be opened. You leave that cave alone." He wouldn't explain further, wouldn't answer questions, wouldn't even let Hon finish his inspection of the fence, just walked away mid-conversation, disappearing into his cabin like a man fleeing daylight. The door slammed. The lock clicked. Hon stood alone in the yard, the echo of Jeremiah's panic still clinging to the cold morning air. In all his years working the Appalachian hills, he had never seen a man react like that. Not to bears, not to storms, not to the countless caves and sinkholes that dotted the mountain range. Something had shaken Jeremiah at a bone-deep level. Hon tried to set the encounter aside, but the memory gnawed at him as he returned to the embankment later that afternoon. Logic told him Jeremiah was being superstitious, fearful of outsiders, or simply protecting his land. But a quieter thought whispered inside him. What if Jeremiah had a reason? When Hon reached the cave entrance, he felt the farmer's presence before he saw him. Turning back toward the hollow floor, he spotted Jeremiah standing at his cabin door, still, silent, gripping the frame with white knuckles, watching, shaking. His face was pale as winter bark, and his eyes held the same expression Hon had seen only once before, in a man who'd witnessed his brother's grave slide open during a flood. Jeremiah Blackthorne wasn't guarding his land. He was warning it, and whatever he feared in Whitmer's Gap had just been uncovered. Morai Hon wasn't a man easily rattled. He had mapped mines, crawled through collapsed drainage tunnels, and surveyed half-finished dams where the air itself tasted like rust. But nothing in his life had prepared him for what waited beneath the slope of Whitmer's Gap. The cave's entrance was narrow enough that he had to crouch, scraping his shoulders as he slipped inside. The light from outside dimmed with every step until even the dust motes seemed to vanish. The silence grew heavier, thicker, pressing like water around him. When the tunnel began to slope downward, Hon felt the temperature drop sharply, followed by a strange, almost electric stillness. 20 or 30 feet in, the tunnel opened abruptly into a space he would later describe only as wrong. A chamber, 20 feet across, circular, perfectly carved, as if shaped by hands rather than erosion. His flashlight beam swept upward, but dissolved into darkness before it reached the ceiling. The walls weren't jagged limestone like the surrounding rock. They were smooth, unnaturally smooth, curving in gentle arcs that reminded him disturbingly of polished bone. But the floor was what rooted him to the spot. Bones. Dozens of them. Not scattered, not piled, arranged. Laid in spirals and branching lines, patterns that almost made sense until he looked too long and the logic unraveled. Deer, rabbits, raccoons, birds, small skulls placed at precise intervals as if marking positions in a map he wasn't meant to understand. They were bleached white, unnaturally clean in a chamber where no sunlight had ever reached. Some gleamed faintly beneath his flashlight, giving the eerie impression they had been handled recently. Hon tried to steady his breath, but the air felt thick, resistant, like he was breathing through cloth. Then he noticed the center, a circular depression carved into the stone itself, 3 feet wide, 6 inches deep. Perfectly smooth, too perfect to be natural. A shallow basin filled with a dark, oily powder that shimmered without reflecting light. When he touched it with a gloved finger, the substance clung to the stone instead, almost recoiling from him. He tried scraping it, scooping it. Nothing. It behaved like a material that didn't want to be removed. That was when it hit him. The feeling. Not sound. Not movement. But presence. as if something stood just behind his flashlight beam, watching, studying, waiting. He spun, expecting to see Jeremiah or an animal or anything that could anchor the dread rising in his chest. But there was only darkness. Darkness so complete it felt inhabited. He realized then that he was holding his breath, because whatever he sensed wasn't breathing. His hands shook, his flashlight flickered. The chamber seemed to narrow, tightening around him like a fist. Hon backed away, steps uneven, nearly slipping on the polished floor as he scrambled toward the tunnel. He didn't remember squeezing back through the entrance. He only remembered the air, sweet, loud, alive, rushing into his lungs when he emerged. He fled without looking back. And when he filed his official survey report, he wrote a single sentence. Cave inaccessible due to instability. It was a lie, because Morai Hon wasn't ready to admit that something deep beneath the mountain had looked back at him. In the weeks after the cave revealed itself, Whitmer's gap changed in ways too subtle for most people to notice, but impossible for those who lived closest to ignore. It began with the animals. Deer trails that had crossed the hollow for generations shifted overnight, curving wide around the new opening, as though guided by some ancient instinct. Tracks that once clustered along the creek banks vanished. Even the raccoons, bold, stubborn creatures that raided cabins without hesitation, stopped approaching the Blackthorn property entirely. Then, the birds went quiet. It wasn't just fewer calls. It was absence, an unnatural, suffocating vacuum of sound that settled over the hollow like a damp cloth. The dawn chorus that had always risen from the oaks and hickories never came. The woods felt hollowed out, emptied, as if the land itself were holding its breath. Octavius Crane was the first to say it out loud. Crane had trapped those ridges for nearly 40 years. He knew the paths animals favored, the bends in the wind, the places where shadow moved differently on certain days. And when he stood on his ridge overlooking the Blackthorn place, watching the silent tree line, he muttered the sentence that spread through the hollow like smoke. Something moved into Whitmer's gap, he said, and everything else is moving out. At first people dismissed it as superstition, a mountain man's way of explaining things he couldn't measure. But then hunters began reporting strange experiences too. One man swore that he felt watched every time he paused to catch his breath. Another claimed the forest shifted around him, turning him in circles until he realized he'd walked half a mile in the wrong direction. Time behaved strangely in those woods. Minutes stretched. Hours disappeared. Tracks doubled back on themselves like the hollow was folding space. Then came the Kessler brothers. Bartach. Nabus and Jeremiah Kessler worked their father's sawmill, felling trees along the upper reaches of the hollow. Barnabas was the steady one, strong, deliberate, the kind of man who could swing an axe true even in a blizzard. But in November of 1952, he began experiencing what he called black gaps, moments where the world thinned, and he'd come back to himself somewhere he hadn't meant to be. The first time it happened, he woke standing knee-deep in leaves at the base of the cave slope, his breath fogging in the cold morning air. He didn't remember walking there. He didn't even remember finishing the tree he'd been cutting. He told himself he must have been tired, overworked. But it kept happening. A cut tree half finished, axe lying abandoned. A trail marked for logging, forgotten mid-step. Lost time, 5 minutes, 10, an hour. And always the same destination. The cave. As if the hollow itself had threads tied around his ribs, tugging him gently down the slope, pulling him toward that dark entrance where the wind refused to blow. He told no one at first. Then Jeremiah confessed the same thing. So did 2 hunters. So did a Kessler cousin. Something was calling people, softly, slowly, patiently. Not loud enough to frighten, just enough to guide. And Whitmer's Gap, once merely unsettling, was becoming something else entirely. A place that wanted company. It began with Jeremiah Blackthorne, the man who knew Whitmer's Gap better than anyone, and yet, in the winter of 1952, seemed to lose all sense of it. Neighbors noticed the first signs in late November, his lantern moving slowly through the trees long after midnight, swaying like a dying firefly as it climbed the slope toward the newly opened cave. At first people assumed he was checking cattle or traps, chores he had done for years. But as the nights grew colder and the snow deepened, it became clear Jeremiah was no longer tending to anything living. He was wandering, boots dragging, head tilted toward the ridge, lantern held out in front of him like he was following something only he could see. During the day, he barely spoke. When Mrs. Cordelia Drummond stopped him on the road to ask why he was out so late, he blinked slowly, like waking from a dream he couldn't explain. "There's voices," he muttered. "Voices in the rocks." Then he walked away. He stopped eating full meals. His cattle went unfed. Firewood piled up unused beside his cabin door. His hands developed a strange grey tint, the nails cracked and filled with dirt, as if he'd been clawing at something underground. And some mornings, when he shuffled back from the direction of the cave just as the sun broke the ridge, people noticed the look in his eyes. Wide, distant, hollow, as if whatever had walked up the slope the night before was not the same thing that walked back down. Sometimes he returned empty-handed, sometimes with mud caked to his palms and forearms. Once, Crane swore Jeremiah's coat smelled of limestone and something else, something sweet and rotten, like wet earth left too long in the dark. The veterans in town whispered that Blackthorne looked like a soldier trapped halfway between two worlds, 1 foot in the present, 1 foot in a place no one else could see. Then the Kessler brothers began lipping. Barnabas was first. He had always been sturdy, dependable. But in early December, Tobias Kessler woke in the middle of the night and found his oldest son standing barefoot on the porch, eyes unfocused, staring toward the hollow. When he shook him, Barnabas gasped like someone pulled from deep water, and couldn't explain why he'd left his bed. The next morning his boots were missing. They were later found halfway up the slope leading to the cave. A week later, Jeremiah Kessler followed the same path, sleepwalking, trembling, whispering fragments of sentences about calling and the deep place when their father tried to wake them. Both brothers grew thinner. Their hands shook during meals. They began disappearing for hours during the day, claiming they were scouting timberlines, but returning exhausted, dirty, glass-eyed. And every set of footprints, Blackthorne's, Barnabas's, Jeremiah's, led toward the same place. The mouth of the cave. By New Year's Eve, the hollow felt abandoned even when people were present. Conversations grew short. Windows stayed shuttered. A quiet dread crept through every cabin like a draught no one could block. It was as if Whitmer's Gap was being emptied from the inside out. First the wildlife, then the people's sleep, then their minds. Not just hollowed physically, hollowed spiritually. Something was taking pieces of them, and the mountain was not done. Cordelia Drummond had lived in Whitmer's Gap longer than anyone, long enough to remember the storms of '29, the influenza winters, and the years when the hollows seemed to breathe differently. She was 74 in 1952, sharp-eyed and stubborn, the kind of mountain widow who noticed the world the way others noticed their own heartbeat, constantly, instinctively, without needing to look. And Cordelia noticed when Whitmer's Gap began changing. She kept a journal, small, leather-bound, worn at the edges, where she recorded births, deaths, weather changes, and strange events the mountains offered from time to time. But nothing in her 70 years prepared her for what she began writing that winter. It started with footsteps. Not one set, not two. Groups. Late at night, usually after 1 a.m., Cordelia would rise from her bed to stir the fire and glance out her kitchen window. From there, she had a clear view down the hollow toward Blackthorn's property. Most nights, the forest was silent, the snow untouched. But then she began seeing shapes, 3 or 4 men, moving in a line toward the upper slope, their bodies stiff, their pace steady, their heads tilted slightly downward, as if following something invisible on the ground. They never carried lanterns. They never spoke. They walked as though guided, pulled by a hand resting between their shoulder blades. Cordelia recognized the outlines: Jeremiah Blackthorn, the Kessler brothers, once even old Octavius Crane trailing behind them, moving like he was half asleep on his feet. They disappeared into the shadows near the cave entrance and would not return for hours. And when they did come back, they moved slower, stumbled more, looked thinner even in the moonlight. They weren't just tired, they were emptied, like each trip took something from them and never gave it back. Cordelia wrote in her journal, "They go up men and come back soku, haddos." But that wasn't the worst of what she witnessed. The worst was the singing. The first time she heard it was December 17th. A sound rising from the ground itself, not from the trees, not from the wind. It was low, almost too low to recognize as a voice. A hum, a vibration, a melody without words, drawn out and mournful, like something practicing speech for the first time. It wasn't human, but it wasn't entirely inhuman either. Cordelia pressed her hands to the window pane and felt it, felt the glass tremble under her palms as the sound traveled up from the mountain's belly. She wrote, "It calls like a mother calling lost children home. The men hear it even when they sleep. The cave has a voice." She tried warning people, tried speaking to the Kesslers, but they turned away, eyes glazed. Tried reaching out to Jeremiah Blackthorn, but he muttered nonsense about obligations beneath the stone. Even Crane avoided her questions, as if afraid the words themselves might drag him back into the dark. Cordelia realized then what no one else was willing to see. The men were not choosing to go to the cave. The cave was choosing them. Whatever dwelled beneath Whitmer's gap had learned to turn longing into a summons. It called softly, patiently, persistently, like a forgotten lullaby rising through the dirt. And night after night, the men answered. The hollow was losing them one by one. And Cordelia Drummond, the widow who saw too much, was left wondering how long the mountain would remain satisfied with only them. Reverend Eldius Whitmore had walked into many troubled hollows during his ministry. Broken marriages, moonshine feuds, old superstitions that needed a firm voice and a steady hand. He believed every darkness had a human root, every evil a man-made shape. When Mrs. Cordelia Drummond wrote to him begging for help, he assumed Whitmer's gap was suffering the same ailments that plagued other mountain communities: hardship, fear, isolation. He arrived expecting sin or sorrow. He did not expect terror. Whitmore stepped off his mule at the edge of the hollow and felt it immediately, an atmosphere he later described as a silence with weight. No birds, no insects, not even the rustle of wind through the branches. The very air seemed held in suspension, like creation itself was listening for something beneath the soil. The residents he met were worse. Jeremiah Blackthorn looked hollow-eyed and lost, his face grey as winter bark. The Kessler brothers spoke in half-sentences, distracted, glancing toward the ridge as if hearing a summons the Reverend could not. Whitmore prayed with them. It didn't help. Their eyes stayed fixed on the mountain, so he decided to see for himself. Against Cordelia's trembling warnings, against his own rising dread, Reverend Whitmore walked toward the cave with a lantern, a Bible, and the conviction that faith could cure whatever afflicted the hollow. The entrance breathed cold air, not a breeze but a slow, rhythmic exhale, like the mountain itself had lungs. Whitmore felt a pressure behind his ears, a buzzing under his skin. Still, he descended. The tunnel swallowed sound. His footsteps made no echo. His breath vanished into stillness. And then the chamber opened before him. A cathedral of darkness. Lantern light flickered over bleached bones arranged in spirals across the floor, patterns too deliberate to be accidental, too ancient to be understood. Walls, smooth as polished ivory, reflected nothing. They seemed to absorb light, swallow it, digest it. And then he saw the journals, dozens of them, maybe more, scattered like offerings around the central depression in the stone. Some belonged to Jeremiah Blackthorne, others to the Kessler brothers, some written in hands he did not recognize. Whitmore knelt beside one and opened it. The writing began clear and legible, then changed. Line after line, page after page, the words devolved into frantic scrawls, phrases repeated until the ink tore through the paper. It calls, it calls, it calls. Another, obligation, obedience. We go because it waits. Another, it lives below. It wants followers. It knows our names. Whitmore dropped the journal. Something moved in the dark above him. Not a shape, not a shadow. A presence. Watching, listening, waiting. He fled. He stumbled out of the cave pale as moonlight, lantern trembling in his hand, Bible clutched to his chest. He collapsed to his knees, gasping, whispering the words that would haunt Whitmer's gap forever. It watches. It calls. It wants followers. Within the hour, he contacted the sheriff. By nightfall, he contacted the state. Whitmer's gap was no longer spiritually sick. It was spiritually claimed. Sheriff Cornelius Bender had handled moonshiners, mine feuds, and flash flood rescues in his 20-plus years across Pocahontas County, but nothing prepared him for Whitmer's gap in the spring of 1953. When Reverend Whitmore's trembling report reached Marlinton, Bender expected hysteria or local superstition gone too far. What he found instead were hollow-eyed men standing on the edge of collapse, Jeremiah Blackthorne gaunt as a scarecrow, the Kessler brothers muttering about obligations, and half the hollow behaving like sleepwalkers waking from a dream they still half belonged to. They weren't drunk. They weren't sick. They were claimed. Bender made the decision fast. Too fast for the men to resist, too slow to erase what the cave had already taken. Deputies hauled the affected men out of Whitmer's gap by force, some shouting, some praying, some clawing at the dirt, like men dragged away from a burning home. Jeremiah Blackthorne had to be restrained. He fought like a wild animal until his strength collapsed into sobs. As the trucks rumbled down the ridge, several of the men twisted in their seats to stare back at the slope where the cave waited behind its curtain of mist and timber. Not a single one of them looked afraid. They looked unfinished. At dawn the next morning, state officials arrived with engineers, concrete mixers, and orders stamped with classifications. Bender had never seen before. No press, no public, no questions. The message was clear. Seal it. Seal all of it. The workers approached the entrance cautiously, their boots crunching over dead leaves that even insects seemed unwilling to disturb. The mouth of the cave exhaled its stale, cold breath as if recognizing them. Several men refused to continue once they felt the temperature drop and the strange pressure in their ears. Sheriff Bender forced himself to stand guard at the opening. He would later admit he never felt more watched in his life. They poured the first wave of concrete by mid-morning, a grey flood that filled the oval throat of the cave. But the state officials weren't satisfied. They ordered steel reinforcement, rebar frames, and a second pour thick enough to bury a freight car. When the final seal hardened, they added another, just to be sure. The mountain shook once as the last load settled, like something inside had shifted or pushed back. Then the mist rolled in again, and Whitmer's Gap grew quiet. Days passed. The change was immediate and unmistakable. The wildlife slowly returned, first insects, then birds, cautious and tentative. The Kessler brothers, removed from the hollow and under heavy supervision, began to speak in full sentences again. Jeremiah Blackthorne remembered how to sleep through the night, though he woke gasping more often than not. But none of the men ever spoke of what they had done inside the cave. Not to the sheriff, not to their families, not even to each other. When asked, their eyes would slide away, as if the memory lived in a place the mind was not meant to revisit. The state sealed the reports behind locked doors. Whitmer's Gap drifted back into uneasy silence. Life resumed. But the mountain did not forget. At night, when fog settled thick and the wind died completely, old residents swore they could still hear something deep beneath the concrete, a low, pulsing thrum, patient as breath. As if the thing below was not buried, only waiting. 2 years passed after the sealing of the cave, 2 long, uneasy years in which Whitmer's Gap slowly knit itself back together, at least on the surface. The Kessler brothers found steadier footing. Jeremiah Blackthorne sold his land and slipped quietly out of the county, and wildlife dared once again to wander near the ridge. Even Reverend Whitmore, though forever changed, tried to believe the worst was behind them. But mountains do not forget, and neither do the things that sleep beneath them. On an early November morning in 1954, Bartholomew Frost, a seasoned hunter from Marlinton, a man who knew the ridges like the lines on his palms, set out alone for deer. He was experienced, capable, and cautious. Frost had survived storms, run-ins with black bears, and more than a few nights turned around in the dark woods. He was no fool. By sunset, he should have been home. By midnight, his camp was found empty. His rifle still leaned against a tree, unfired. His pack hung from a limb, untouched. His footprints circled the clearing once, then stopped. Not veered, not stumbled. Stopped, as if he'd stepped off the earth mid-stride. Search teams from 3 counties arrived the next morning. They combed the ridges in widening grids. They dragged the creek. They brought dogs, lanterns, even a plane from Charleston. But Frost had evaporated from the world, leaving behind no blood, no broken branches, no signs of animal attack. Just absence. The same kind Morai Hon felt when he dropped a stone into that cave and heard nothing return. On the second day of the search, a deputy kneeling near Frost's last known tracks pressed his palm to the soil. It vibrated. Not like machinery, not like distant thunder, but like something shifting far, far below. Slow, rhythmic pulses travelling upward through stone. When he called others over, the vibrations intensified. Several searchers report. Ted a strange sensation in their teeth, a faint metallic hum, as if the mountain were exhaling through them. The deputy took a step back and whispered, "It's still down there." Word spread through the teams. Men who'd once dismissed the Whitmer's Gap stories found themselves glancing at the sealed slope, imagining the thick concrete barrier cracking, the thing beneath it stirring awake. On the third day, the sheriff called off the deep wood searches. Officially, they cited terrain hazards and hunter error. Unofficially, several deputies refused to return to the area after sundown. The final report listed Frost's disappearance as misadventure, the standard label for someone lost to the elements. A clean conclusion for messy fear. A tidy phrase for a man who simply vanished into thin mountain air. But locals around Whitmer's Gap told a different story. They said the earth had taken him. They said the cave was not dead, only buried. They said the thing sealed beneath the limestone had grown still and starved. And when it felt footsteps above it, it reached up. Bartholomew Frost was only the first. but not the last name whispered in the hollow when the wind stopped moving and the soil began to tremble. By the summer of 1958, Whitmer's Gap had faded into rumor. The concrete seals were holding. Wildlife had cautiously returned, and the people who remembered the winter of '53 spoke of it only in low voices, as if discussing it too loudly might wake something best left sleeping. But the university didn't believe in superstition. They believed in geology. A research team from West Virginia University, 4 promising graduate students and 1 ambitious professor, arrived with ground-penetrating radar, acoustic instruments, and the kind of academic confidence only people untouched by the hollow's history could possess. Their mission was simple: map the underground formations sealed in '53, prove the psychological effects were environmental, and publish a groundbreaking paper. Their first mistake was assuming the cave wanted to be studied. Using modern equipment, they found a second access point, a narrow fracture in the ridge 50 yards from the sealed entrance. With permission from the state, they widened it just enough for a rope team to descend. The moment their boots touched stone, the mountain shifted. The initial findings thrilled them. The chamber Hon discovered was only the beginning. A small antechamber to a far older, far deeper system. Their maps showed interconnected tunnels, stretching like veins beneath the hollow, lined with smooth stone that reflected no sound. The deeper they went, the more impossible the formations became. Walls polished like ivory, ceilings disappearing into void, bone arrangements older than the ones Hon had found, markings carved with precision no animal could produce. But the biggest change wasn't in the cave. It was in the people entering it. By the 4th day, the symptoms began. Students stayed underground longer than scheduled. They stopped taking breaks. They scribbled notes compulsively, pages filled with symbols instead of language. One insisted he needed to continue mapping the lower passages, though no such passages were officially recorded. Another student returned from the cave with no memory of how she'd spent the previous 3 hours. Their professor dismissed the behavior as stress until the night the team was found missing from camp. A search party located them deep inside the system, far beyond the mapped boundaries. Their lanterns were dark, their faces expressionless, and in the center of the chamber, sitting amid a ring of bone spirals, was graduate student Cornelius Blackwood. He was upright, eyes wide, breathing slow, unmoving. When they tried to speak to him, he didn't blink. When they dragged him out, he didn't resist. Once outside, he asked a single question. "Why did you pull me away?" It wasn't finished. Within 48 hours, every member of the research team displayed the same symptoms. Trance-like episodes, compulsive returning to the cave, refusal to leave the hollow, fixation on obligations to something below. The state intervened immediately. The new access hole was sealed with reinforced concrete. The team was hospitalized under psychiatric supervision. Whitmer's Gap was officially classified as a restricted geological hazard zone, closed to all visitors. Unofficially, everyone who'd lived through 1952-53 recognized the signs. The cave was awake again, and it had found new voices to call. By 1962, Whitmer's Gap should have been a closed book, sealed in concrete, buried in state archives, forgotten by everyone except the few who lived through its worst years. But the mountain had other plans. That spring, inspectors found the first cracks. Hairline fractures in the concrete seals, airflow readings that shouldn't have existed, geophones picking up faint tremors beneath the hollow, not seismic, not mechanical, but rhythmic. The state patched the cracks. They reinforced the barrier. They updated the warning signs. But the ground kept breathing. By 1967, the forest around Deer Creek had developed a reputation even locals wouldn't joke about. Families who'd lived there for generations refused to cut timber or hunt near the old cave site. Loggers said the trees grew wrong, twisted slightly, leaning as if trying to pull away from the slope where the entrance had once gaped open. Night after night, residents reported the same thing, a low hum, not loud, not constant, but steady, like something deep beneath the earth was testing its own voice again. Sometimes it came through the soil, felt more than heard. Sometimes it reverberated through cabin floors. Sometimes it drifted through the woods like a vibration in the bones rather than the air. Authorities blamed underground water channels. Geologists blamed frost heave. Everyone else blamed what they already knew, but refused to say aloud. The cave had never truly gone silent. As the years moved into the 1970s and 80s, the stories spread. Hikers passing near the restricted zone reported the sensation of being watched, a pressure on the back of the neck, a presence pacing just out of sight behind the tree line. They turned around and found nothing. But the feeling remained, an invisible weight that drove them back downhill faster than they intended. Hunters avoided the area entirely, even the bravest. Ones refused to track deer through Whitmer's Gap, saying the woods there were wrong. The animals moved strangely, skirting the hollow like they sensed something older and hungrier beneath their hooves. And then there were the disappearances, small, unconfirmed, whispered about only in back rooms of grocery stores and on the edge of church potlucks. A missing camper here, a lost hiker there, people who had no reason to walk toward the sealed site, yet vanished in the direction of it all the same. No bodies, no tracks, just absence. By the 1990s, the area was fenced off completely. By the 2000s, it was considered a state hazard zone. Today, it remains restricted, patrolled, monitored, and officially inactive. But locals know better. On certain nights, the cold, still ones when fog sits low and the trees hardly move, those who live near Deer Creek swear they can feel something beneath the forest floor. A slow pulse, a patient vibration, like a heartbeat too deep to belong to anything living on the surface, not shifting rock, not wind trapped in caverns, not water running through limestone. Something deeper, something that once had followers, something that called a hollow full of people into its darkness and never gave all of them back. And more than 60 years later, some believe it's waiting for new ones. If you made it this far, you're one of the brave ones. Tell me in the comments, do you think Whitmer's Gap was geological, psychological, or something we don't have a name for yet? And if you ever find yourself walking deep in the Appalachian woods and the ground beneath you begins to hum, turn back. Some doors were sealed for a reason. Stay curious, stay cautious, and I'll see you in the next chronicle of America's Forgotten Shadows.